All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of Elevate Your Grind, brought to you by the Cannabis Lab. I am your host, Todd Rosales, and it is lovely to be here on this Monday. Although you're not watching on Monday, I'm really going to have to get used to the whole recording thing, so I'm on the same page as you. Folks, we have an amazing 2023 plan for Cannabis Lab. We are expanding across the state of Florida. Check us out. We're going to be doing events this year in Tampa, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. So if you are any of those cities or any of the surrounding areas, please check us out at joinclab.com. Get involved. We're going to do 3 to 4 events in each one of the geographies every month. We'd love to see you. We'd love to have you. We'd love you to be a member, and we'd love you to come join us for some fun. Folks, if you need to see any of these episodes, we're available anywhere you can find your podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and of course, www.youtube.com/@thecannabis.lab. Folks, we've got a great guest for you today. So one of the things I'm starting to do now that we've talked to probably about 200 people in the cannabis space is we're bringing back some of these experts, and they've already given us their background. They've given us their story. We want to see where they are, where their next part in the journey is, but we also want to talk about things that are topical to the industry right now. One of the biggest issues in the industry right now is payments. Not even right now. It's been a huge issue since the beginning of time with cannabis, right? Very cash intensive business. And that doesn't bode well to the way that business is done today. I mean, at the end of the day, there are governments that are trying to phase cash out. They've been trying to get rid of the penny forever. So here we are, a very cash dependent industry in a non-cash world. So, to tell us all things cash and non-cash today, please welcome a good friend of the show, a good friend to me since I've been into the industry, Tyler Beuerlein, the Chief Strategic Business Development Officer at Safe Harbor Financial. Tyler, welcome back, man.
Thanks for having me, Todd. Always a pleasure, man.
Absolutely. I mean, you have more speaking engagements in this industry than anyone I've ever seen. So I am very happy for you to be sitting down with us today.
Thanks. This is great to be here, man.
So
I'm surprised
Tyler,
I haven't got the candy cane hook by now, but I'm still kicking. So
no, not even a little bit, man. So Safe Harbor, man, you guys have been all over the headlines. Maybe it's just my LinkedIn feed, but on an M&A spree as well as going public through a SPAC. Tell us a little bit about Safe Harbor and what you guys are doing there.
yeah, so Safe Harbor was really was founded by Sunday Seafried, who, she's a legend in the cannabis banking space. She started the program at Partner Colorado Credit Union at the very beginning in Colorado, and Safe Harbor was an entity that enabled us to expand far and wide. So we currently bank all state legal markets. We are actively lending in most state legal markets across the country. We were fortunate to be able to go public on NASDAQ recently. It happened a couple of months ago. And as such, we're continuing to expand. We're trying to build out the most robust set of features. And I would say a full suite of financial services that make it, hands down the best place to be from a banking standpoint. And so in that vein, we acquired Abaca recently, got, big news. Really, great to be able to work with Dan and Brian now and have that tech infrastructure in place. And we're just excited about where we're going. And we've got a number of, I would say, things on the horizon that are going to be amazing for the industry.
Beautiful, man. So you guys are doing something that essentially the government can't even pass in the House right now, or in the Senate. Sorry. You guys are providing banking services to the cannabis industry. And I know that's not part of the things that you can't do, but it is rare to see that, especially offering a full suite of financial services to the cannabis space. One of the things I love about this industry is there's always going to be entrepreneurs that are willing to do whatever they can to make sure that this industry has the services it needs. How are you guys able to do that when so many others can't?
It's not that they can't, Todd. It's that they won't. They don't. You got to understand, in the banking world, banks and credit unions are risk averse by nature, and not only is there a compliance burden on institutions, not only is there potential charter risk, but there's also personal liability. So if an executive of a bank or credit union does something wrong, they can have a civil money penalty imposed on them personally that isn't covered by the insurance policy of the bank or credit union. So there's a lot of risk involved. I can tell you that, obviously we've been in it from the beginning. We understand the regulatory hurdles. I would argue maybe better than anybody in the country. And it's that foundation that enables us to thrive in this space and expand And to your point about SAFE, one of the challenges I've personally had with that legislation is the fact that this industry is banked. Whether anybody wants to acknowledge that or not, every time I see an article saying, there's a banking crisis, there's a cash crisis, there is not an operator, a licensed operator in this country that we can't bank today. So, for everybody that's, shouting that from the rooftops, I may be the most easily accessible person in this industry. I'm fairly certain my numbers on bathroom walls at this point. There's no reason why they shouldn't have a bank account.
I think I wrote it there.
Yeah, you might have. Probably a few others too.
At least the email addresses. No, but you're right. And it's
Yeah.
interesting. So would you say the biggest battle that you have to fight in doing what you do is really the battle against misinformation? Because, and I don't even think it's just the people outside the industry. I think there are so many operators inside of this space that believe the narratives that they see on LinkedIn and believe the narratives that they see in the news and are not even attempting to find someone who will bank them or figure out the right way to do payments or anything along those lines, because that is the narrative across across the spectrum there, that cannabis companies can't be banked. And so many of them, especially the smaller, more independent ones, are buying old bank buildings and things for vaults. I mean, I even spoke to a professional at the ArcView event that handles cash logistics, and just hearing the way that some of these companies handle their cash is absolutely ridiculous. And if they're not being banked, then obviously they don't really have a safe place to put it. So would you say that misinformation or just not uniform information being given out across the board is probably the biggest hindrance to this industry accessing banks?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of misinformation, potentially a combination of either laziness and or an anti-establishment mentality where they don't want the transparency in some cases, right? Maybe they're doing something they shouldn't be doing and they don't want to be in the banking system. Um, but I think it really comes into payments. The narratives I hear on the payment side are just, to me, mind blowing. Because I've I would say gotten to see a different side of the payment space, behind the scenes, and so knowing things and then seeing what's being portrayed or the messaging being sent out to the industry, it's there's a massive chasm, right? And so sometimes I've been very vocal about certain things over the years, and I would say that there's some folks that probably aren't big fans as a result, but it's always coming from pure honesty and transparency. That's how we've always operated. That's how we have to operate. And so while people may not want to hear it, it is what it is.
Yeah, and typically I'll handle the transitions in these conversations, but you led us down an amazing path here of where I wanted to go next, because your LinkedIn posts a lot of times are points of clarity to me, right? Because you go out, you go to conferences or you go to meetings and stuff, and you hear all these things, and typically coming from salespeople, let's be honest, of people that are trying to innovate payments in the cannabis space, and whether that's this solution or that solution or that solution. And at the end of the day, probably once a month I'll see a post from you that's like, this can't be done. No matter what anyone is saying, this can't be done. You were one of the first, I don't want to say anti-proponents of it, but essentially saying that you can't use cashless ATMs. There's going to be a crackdown. Something's going to happen eventually. That all of the major networks came out and said, we are not supporting these. And people out there on LinkedIn, in person, wherever they are, were very vocal in saying, oh, that went away, that doesn't matter, and continued with these cashless ATMs. So, before you explain, essentially, folks, what a cashless ATM is it's just kind of what it says. It looks just like an ATM transaction where no actual cash is exchanged. So for example, if I went to a dispensary and my bill was $94, they would charge me $100 plus the service fee, which would look like an ATM transaction, and give me the physical cash back of the difference. And that's how they would get their money, which was a gray area. So can you talk to us about cashless ATMs and if you know why they're not allowed and what's going to happen now for the people who are using them or used them?
Yeah, well, so
And did I get that right? That's just
multifaceted.
my
Yeah, you did.
understanding.
You did, and I guess what people fail to realize, and I see it from a different lens, right? Because people see it from the payment side and the industry side, but they don't understand that the only side that really matters is the regulatory and banking side of these mechanisms, right? Because they all have to travel through the financial system, and The only shocking thing to me about the cashless ATMs is how long it took to get them shut down. Because I can tell you unequivocally, there were eyeballs on this going back 3 years ago when they started. And when I say eyeballs, I'm talking, the type that you don't necessarily want to see looking into something if you're trying to get away with it, right? So, fast forward a few years, I would guess that cashless ATMs this past year accounted for between $6 and $8 billion worth of transactions.
Wow.
That's a massive amount of money. And from a network and banking perspective, it's presented to the acquiring bank as a cash withdrawal from an ATM. And while this may sound to the industry like, well, why is this even an issue? Well, at the end of the day, it goes back to, and there are varying levels of it, but I would argue that it's basically fraud. They're defrauding the system to use a network that's opposed to the industry to facilitate these transactions. And if you go back to some of the other payment products that have been in the space, I mean, we all know the e-story, right? We all know what came out of that. And there are people serving time as a result. And that was strictly credit cards. If you look to the stored value products that were using credit cards to load, there was a major example of that. And I don't want to name names, but I tried to warn a lot of people there too, and people didn't want to listen, right? And that's fine. I understand people have to operate their business, but if you choose to take a shortcut or you choose to use something that's, I'm going to say gray or not above board, it's not if, it's when, right? And the impact on your business at that point, I don't know how you quantify it, but it's not something I want to see, but I knew it was something that was coming, and I tried to warn people as much as possible. A lot of times it falls on deaf ears.
It is nuts to me, and I don't know if you have the answer to this question, that these same, payment networks have no problem, or at least as far as I know, they have no problem with their ATMs being inside of a dispensary. But the cashless ATM, obviously, to me, it sounds like the biggest thing that is stopping it is just the networks are opposed to being involved in cannabis transactions right now because of the federal illegality of it. So, for example, if I go to my local dispensary down the street here and I pick what I want and I stop at the ATM and I put in my Visa debit card and take out cash and spend that cash on cannabis, there's no issue with that whatsoever. It's still within the same building. But if it's an automated process, obviously it is, because it is directly involved in the transaction, it seems to be a problem there. Has anyone ever come out and been opposed to actually having their networks ATMs not work within a dispensary? Because that doesn't seem to be an issue.
No, it doesn't. It's not an issue. It's really what the transaction is being used for. So if somebody withdraws cash from a dispensary, what happens with that cash after that point is not the concern of the networks, right? If you're purchasing it, if you're purchasing something that's federally illegal to the networks, that falls under the same regulatory oversight as any other nefarious activity. So group it in with, all of the, and I don't even feel comfortable mentioning some of those out loud, but it's the same grouping. One thing I have found with ATMs, which has been interesting, is bank and credit union regulators have come into institutions when they examine them, and they've been very concerned with the monies being laundered through those units. So there has been pushback on the physical ATMs a little bit there, but as long as they're owned and operated by a verified third party, they seem to be very comfortable with it. And from a acquiring standpoint, those institutions are fine with that. So it is, I understand the industry's heartburn over it, but it's reality. I mean,
And it makes sense, even as a patient or a customer or whatever you want to call it. I love the one less step that I would have to take to get my cash out, because I am that guy who shows up, buys a bunch of stuff to like cash only. And I'm like, oh yeah, I got $40. Where's your ATM? And I'm running to the ATM and holding up the people behind me. And then just, as the Jewish New Yorker, I have the anxiety that they're getting mad at me and things like that. So it was a nice change of pace. But, obviously it's not good for the industry, especially like I'm a big fan of this industry following regulations, because I think that's the easiest way to get people to accept it more. So, cashless ATMs are out. This is still a very cash heavy industry. There is absolutely no way that you could really use credit cards right now, at least, above board, what type of payment systems besides just straight cash are really available to folks out there? Because our society in general is really moving away from cash as much as it can.
Yeah, there are a few options. So we've seen the rise of pin-based debit in the industry. Uh, those companies are getting very creative in the way that they route transactions through regional debit networks. So I think you're going to see a rise of that. Now, whether or not that can survive remains to be seen, right? There's still some ambiguity there. ACH products are permissible. So if you look at, the CanPays, the AeroPays, the Strongholds of the world, those products will survive into perpetuity. They've all worked directly with financial institutions that bank this industry, that understand it, that move the money on their behalf. And that is the one network that I would say has been most proactive in assisting. So not ideal from a consumer experience perspective, but those products will survive and continue to thrive, I would say.
In recent times, I've heard rumblings of payment processors that are in the process of trying to set up a credit card for the industry. Now, that credit card would run on their own rails, but obviously that would be limited to the amount of clients that they have from a payment processing standpoint. So it's really interesting. Obviously, it is a competitive advantage if you can offer credit on that network, but you'd still have to rip and replace whatever payment processor you're using. I don't know how common that is in cannabis now, but I know in regular business, it's a giant pain in the ass. And when I say regular, I mean like my dad's mechanic shop for that matter, right? So on that note, do you see this as something that's going to be feasible for the industry, or something that's going to be stood up before we see like a Visa or MasterCard come into this space?
Uh, I don't. I've seen. I mean, keep in mind, Todd, over the last decade, I've probably seen no less than 300 payment providers come and go,
Yeah.
right? And they've all got the plan, right? They've all got the solution. I do think there's an opportunity for another product, which I won't talk about because it's something that interests us. But I think that whether it be crypto or a private label credit card that doesn't use those networks, or stored value. I saw a recent instance where there was a stored value provider that was allowing consumers to load via credit card and then use it. That's been done, and it imploded, and for many reasons. And so, I get concerned when I see these products come out because although I applaud the ingenuity, they're I see them creating more harm than doing
Yeah.
good.
No, it totally makes sense. And I've seen it too. I've seen the ones, the stored value where you can add credit cards, and the stored value ones are interesting. The problem to me has always been the inconsistency, at least for me, in where I can and can't spend it. Can pay, at least in Florida, had a pretty strong foothold for a while. And I'm only calling them out from names from my experience using them, but it's a giant pain in the ass, especially down here where like we don't have brands. It's not like I can go to my favorite dispensary like I could in California and they have the top 20 brands that I buy. Right here in Florida, I go somewhere for vape carts because they have the best. I go somewhere else for flour because they have the best, and so on and so forth. Right. So I'm using multiple different dispensaries because the dispensaries carry their own brand, their own products. So payments down here for us, especially store value, are super complicated. Are you starting to see any of those companies or the ACH companies that have really just gotten a nice market share that are going to be more popular? Because I think that's the biggest problem with any of these payment solutions that are above board is they just don't have the wide area network to be the staple.
Yeah, I think the three I mentioned, I think obviously CanPay, AeroPay, Stronghold, Dutchy's got an ACH product. I think those will gain momentum, but to your point, they're cumbersome from a user perspective, right? And they're not ideal. The bigger problem with stored value, Todd, is that you got to remember when you have a stored value product, those funds are being pulled into a bank account somewhere,
Yeah.
right? And furthermore, the networks have gotten wise to it, and they've written in specific rules and regs around what they call ins and outs. So they don't want a prohibited product being loaded into a product and then sent out. And what we found, and the biggest risk there is not only is it a compliance nightmare for any bank or credit union to try and take that on, but those funds are very easy to be seized by a regulator. So if one of those companies does something wrong, and this has already happened in our industry in a grand scale, and again, I don't want to mention names, but you're talking about a giant amount of money seized and gone, and that went into receivership. And there may be cases still where these operators that whose consumers' funds were held there are owed hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. And so, going back to the compliance side, it's a non-starter.
It's crazy to me that in today's day and age, really the safest way to transact business in our industry is just pure cash, right? The electronic payments are it seems to be a risk with any way that you're doing it. And there are workarounds for the people like me who forget to stop at the ATM or don't realize that they don't have cash on them because, they stopped at the McDonald's drive-thru or something along those ways. And it's crazy to me that that's what we're seeing. What is it going to take? Is it going to take something like safe banking or any of these other acts to get us access, or is it going to take a general descheduling of cannabis itself to get us access to, a straightforward debit card system or credit card system?
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I am of the belief that it's going to take federal legality. And again, I spent a lot of time with the stakeholders, and despite what's being pushed out publicly about SAFE, the networks have been very specific about federal legality from the beginning. And so the SAFE would not change the federal legal status of the product. The networks don't want to take on that risk. And so it would depend on how the final language was written. But I would say the chance of them coming in, even if SAFE passed, was, if I had to guess, less than 10%.
Yeah.
And the industry doesn't seem to realize that.
It's funny because that's some of the things I start to think about. By no means am I an expert. I'm just someone who likes to pontificate, but SAFE has failed 6 times on the Senate floor. And, you see progression on the banking side of this industry, specifically what you're doing at Safe Harbor, right? Like you said, there's not a licensed operator that you can't bank. Banking exists in this industry. At this point, would Safe just kind of enable the cannabis industries to be able to access like small business loans or lines of credit or anything along those lines? Like, what are we really relying for safe banking to pass at this point if it's not going to bring the debit or credit cards into this?
I actually believe the motivating factors for SAFE right now are just simply the ability for the MSOs to uplist to the U.S. exchanges.
That'd be amazing.
I think that's the driving motivation, regardless of what's being put out in the market. Um, I think that's where the lobbying money is coming from. And look, that would be a huge win for the industry. I think if SBA loans opened up, that would be a big win for the industry. But is SAFE going to compel a bunch of institutions to come into the market? Probably not.
Yeah.
Again, they're very risk averse by nature. It doesn't change the federal legal status. The other side of this is I've heard lending can be an issue, but lending is an issue in mainstream commercial real estate right now. And whether or not people realize it, there are banks that have lent billions to the industry in the last 2 years. There are a number of them, and there are other institutions that are continuing to expand their lending programs. We're one of them. Our capacity, we expect to grow. We expect to lend, pretty aggressively on real estate going forward. So yeah, Todd, SAFE is its own animal. Pretty opinionated about it, in case you couldn't tell. I think that the way it's being represented to the industry is drastically different than the reality of it. And I don't, to your point, I care about this industry. Even when I'm vocal about something and people don't want to hear it, it's because I care. It's not
Yeah.
because I'm trying to burn anybody's house down. But so yeah,
No, I
I think
agree.
I think the effects would be minimal.
I'm on the same page. It's a conversation I have with my wife often is she sees, she sees a lot of money going to psychedelics and psychedelic therapy and things like that. And when she hears my stories about the horrors in the cannabis space, she keeps asking me why. And I tell her that not all psychedelics are Schedule 1. So, there are other access that they can have, whereas cannabis in general is Schedule 1. There are not different versions of cannabis unless you want to get into like Delta 8, Delta 10, the minor cannabinoids. And that's just not something that I'm doing or want to do personally, right? So, my fear right now is we're at a point in time where access to capital for cannabis companies is starting to get really, really tight. I've mentioned this post 100 times. Carson Helmiston, founder of Vanks, $1.6 billion into the cannabis industry from venture capital in 2021, less than $300 million from venture capital in 2022 as of October. I don't know what has happened since then, but obviously a significant drop off in the amount of money coming into this space. And my theory, because I don't actually do the research, I just talk about it on the camera until someone corrects me, is that we've had a lot of private wealth propping up this industry, not propping up, but investing in this industry for a long time. And they're tied up in their original investments, and they haven't had a liquidation event or a liquidity event in order to continue to reinvest that money into the industry. And they're having to continue to put more money into the investments that they have. Right. And that's where I see scarcity in this industry. So I'm always looking to what's next that's going to allow more money, whether it's institutional or private, to come into this space, because I want to see a lot of these smaller businesses that are not MSOs survive. Nothing against the MSOs, getting them onto the exchanges and getting them access to the retail investors in America, because I can tell you, as someone who has traded through both Robinhood and Merrill Edge, you can't buy those stocks. I remember calling up Merrill Lynch and being like, hey, I want to buy Trulieve and GTI. And they're like, you can't, it's illegal. So, you can buy them through MSOS or PSDN and all the other ETFs. Maybe them getting listed on the exchanges will allow them to invest like tech companies do and have a venture arm and invest in smaller brands that they would eventually, absorb. But I'm really curious to know what is going to inspire more money coming into this industry so these smaller companies can continue to grow and scale that are having access, having trouble accessing capital.
Well, to your point, Todd, I think that if the MSOs got access to the markets, I actually think it would take a different path. I think you would see an acquisition spree that would be, sizable. I
Yeah.
think that these guys would get acquired immediately by mainstream companies. I think you would see a gobbling up of real estate surge in the industry, and they know it. And I think that's why they push so hard for things that they think would compel that. I think, Todd, I think the more that state markets open up and become successful and people and the stigma continues to go away, I think you're going to see private investors really continue to prop this up. I mean, especially in limited license markets. But I think it's going to be rough sledding on the capital markets for a while. And one of the reasons is we've seen massive liquidity over the last 2 years, right? Whether it be PP or all of these different liquidity events. I mean, it's one of the reasons why we're dealing with such massive inflation. And I think that people were just throwing money at things, right? That they were interested in. They had,
Yeah.
sudden liquidity surge and they want to invest in something that they thought could get them a return. Cannabis is obviously a polarizing topic. And so they naturally went there. But to your point, those days might be done. And now it's going to come down to fundamentals
Yeah.
and what operators can execute on their plan, continue to have success. And I think it's going to move more into a distressed capital standpoint where you've got savvy investors that are coming in to pick up assets at, lower valuations. And I think that's where the capital is going to come from, unfortunately.
I mean, that was my plan if I would have hit that $1.4 billion Powerball, but it was in California, not in Florida, unfortunately.
Dang it.
But I was trying. I was going to fund the industry with half of it, but I could not. Um, but it is interesting, man. I want to see this industry succeed, and I want to see money come in, and obviously the M&A that would happen would be very beneficial. But I agree with you. I think you have smart investors that are waiting on the sideline. They also know, like you said, that a lot of really great assets are going to become distressed, and that's just unfortunate right now. And they're going to come in, they're going to buy at a great price, and they're going to make a ton of money. So the conversations that I've heard both ways, that it's going to continue to be a desert. And I've heard that, come end of Q1 next year, you're going to see a lot more money coming in because a lot of things are going to be cheaper and people are going to be lowering their valuations and just to take on cash. So it's interesting to see happen. It's not something that I'd love to see happen for my friends and fellow entrepreneurs in the space, but I think it is what's going to happen. And you're 100% right there.
But I think, Todd, I think in a way it's healthy, right? I mean, every market goes through these ebbs and flows, and we've got to get it right. and I think we're getting there. People are understanding that they're operating a business, right?
Yeah.
And they've got to focus on the right assets and the right markets. I also think that, people have learned a lot of hard lessons, whether it be in unlimited license markets or getting into the wrong state market, right? That can, make a great investment poor quickly. If you're just, if it doesn't really matter how well your business operates, if you're in the wrong market, it's going to be tough sledding, right? So I think people are waking up to that fact.
We just didn't do a good enough job taking all the money from those NFT nerds while they were bragging about it.
Yeah. Oh man, don't get
Yep.
me started on that
We
one.
should have
I
just
also
taken all the
thought
money from the NFT nerds.
yeah, one other thing that I'll say, and again, this is probably going to be unpopular, but I think that one of the first distressed assets to come on the market are going to be the Canadian LPs. I think
Yep.
they're in big trouble. Uh, I think they've been in big trouble for a while, but now I think it's, you know, I think days are numbered there. So it's going to be interesting to see that shake out as well.
You know what blew my mind, and this is kind of off the main topic here, is how many people didn't realize the population of Canada, right? I had so many people looking at Canada as a market that were US companies, and they're like this, that, and the other. And one of the things that I noticed, in my time running a cannabis brand was something as simple as how many people in a certain geography. I know that sounds dumb, but I look at Canada and you have only 30 million people spread across the entire country, obviously into, significantly concentrated geographies, but there are a lot of rural areas in Canada as well too. And it's only 30 million people. Whereas you can concentrate on either California, Florida, or New York is obviously not fully operational yet, but all three of those states have 30 million people each, and they're a lot smaller. Like
But,
when we
but
were
Todd,
looking,
it was never about Canada. The money that went in there was purely because they had access to the US capital markets. And the plan was they were going to raise a massive amount of money. They were going to perfect their craft and they were going to acquire everything in the US. And the problem is, and it's been a running joke for me since for the last 8, 10 years in the industry, like clockwork. Every year, come probably September or October, I would hear a Canadian LP CEO come out and say, we've got word this is the year that the federal legal barriers are gone in the US and we're coming in to acquire everything. And the problem for them is the MSOs have now taken too much real estate. They're too strong. They've got too large of a footprint. And that's happened while their assets have just dwindled.
yeah.
Right. And so I think the roles have reversed. And even if federal legality occurred tomorrow, that could the thing that they've hedged their bets on for all these years, I think could be the thing that kills them the fastest because they have no power to come in and acquire anything at this point.
No, it's crazy to me. Like that, and just going back to the geography thing, if I were a brand or a company that wanted to expand to Canada, the amount of people that I would need to just physically cover the geography to sell cannabis versus like I look in a market like Massachusetts with 10 million people plus tourists, I can have someone live in Boston and drive to the entire state every day. So that always
Well,
blew my mind.
and to that point too, Todd, that's why it's so important from an investor standpoint to understand the dynamic in markets. I mean, in Oklahoma, I think at one point they'd issued a license for every 90 patients.
Yep.
And then you look at a state like people don't think about this state, but Utah. Utah's got 15 retail licenses in the entire state and only 8 cultivation licenses. And so your floor there is extremely high. Your ceiling is even higher. Um, despite the fact that it's very restrictive. So I think to your point, it's just there are examples in the U.S. of why those companies will fail in Canada.
No, I agree, man. It is such an interesting industry. You know that I can talk about it forever. We are on the top of the hour. I know you're a busy man. Before I let you go, though, just because I am a simpleton and obviously I think of banking and payments and things like that, talk to us about other things that companies can work with Safe Harbor on, things that you may be offering that other people might not, or just better than other people as well.
Yeah, I think, look, here's what I can tell you. We understand this industry innately. We've been doing it for a long time. The team has been doing it since the beginning. We understand what the industry needs from a feature set perspective. We understand what the industry needs from a pricing perspective. We understand what the industry needs from a footprint perspective. I would argue we're the only entity that can cover the entire country for operators. We're getting very aggressive in the way that we price accounts to benefit the industry. And we're getting very aggressive from a feature set perspective, not to mention lending is now in house. So, you know, what I would tell people is if you want a one stop shop that encompasses everything you would ever need in a relationship, we're it. And those feature sets are only going to get stronger. Not to mention, you have access to the team. And while that might not sound like much, there are ways that we help our clients, you know, outside of banking, outside of payments, outside of lending. You know, just they have access to us. So, you know, I would say if you're somebody that's struggling with banking, or if you're somebody that just wants to be in a better situation, we're here. We're here. We're not going anywhere, and we'd be happy to have you as a client.
Beautiful. Well, we would love to have you down here for the Cannabis Lab conference in June. So hopefully we can get you down here for that. Miami in June, a little hot, but we got
Yeah,
great.
I
We
live in
got
Arizona. All
yeah,
good.
we've got great air conditioning though. So
Yeah.
would love to have you down for that. And Tyler, short of walking us into the men's room and showing us the bathroom stall wall, how do people get in contact with you?
Email address is tyler@shfinancial.org. My cell phone number is 480-650-1110. Call anytime, email anytime, nights, weekends, I'm around. My
Awesome,
wife
man.
might kill me, but you know, it's part of
She
it.
might. I know how that
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah.
Tyler, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everybody at home for watching. Of course, if you missed any part of this interview, you can always check out this interview or the rest of them at youtube.com/@thecannabis.lab. If you want to find out more about what Cannabis Lab does and how you can get involved, check us out at www.joinclab.com. Folks, it's been another episode of Elevate Your Grind. We'll see you next week.